People who hate having guests over often place a strong emphasis on emotional boundaries, seeing their home as an extension of their inner world rather than a shared social space. Psychology suggests that for these individuals, the home represents safety, predictability, and emotional regulation, making the presence of others feel intrusive rather than pleasant. For many, the discomfort is not rooted in dislike for people but in the loss of control that guests bring. Guests disrupt routines, alter sensory environments, and introduce unpredictability, which can be deeply unsettling for individuals who rely on structure to feel emotionally balanced. The home is often the only place where such individuals feel fully unmasked. In social settings, people frequently perform roles, manage impressions, and suppress impulses. When guests enter the home, that performance can feel forced back into existence, creating emotional exhaustion rather than connection. Psychology also links this behavior to heightened sensitivity to external stimuli. Noise, movement, conversation, and even subtle changes in atmosphere can overwhelm people who are more sensitive to their environment, making the idea of hosting deeply stressful. Control over space plays a crucial role as well. When guests are present, hosts may feel pressured to entertain, accommodate, and manage others' comfort, which shifts attention away from their own emotional needs and creates internal tension. Some individuals associate guests with judgment, whether real or imagined. The fear of being evaluated for cleanliness, lifestyle, or personal choices can trigger anxiety, especially for those with perfectionist tendencies or past experiences of criticism. Psychology notes that people who strongly value autonomy may experience guests as a symbolic loss of freedom. The inability to relax, change clothes, rest, or behave naturally while others are present can feel like a violation of personal liberty. There is also an emotional labor component that many underestimate. Hosting requires constant social monitoring, conversation management, and emotional responsiveness, which can feel draining for people who already invest heavily in emotional self-regulation. In some cases, the aversion to guests is connected to past experiences where boundaries were ignored. Repeated exposure to intrusive visitors can condition someone to associate guests with stress rather than enjoyment. Ultimately, psychology views this behavior not as antisocial, but as a protective strategy. Avoiding guests becomes a way to preserve emotional stability, personal space, and a sense of inner control. Personality plays a significant role in how individuals feel about hosting guests. Introverted personalities, for instance, often recharge through solitude and may find extended social interaction at home particularly draining. Highly conscientious individuals may experience stress over the perceived responsibility of being a good host. The pressure to meet internal standards can turn hosting into a source of anxiety rather than pleasure. Psychology also highlights the role of neurodiversity. People with autism or ADHD may struggle with unexpected social demands, sensory overload, or disruptions to routine, making guests feel overwhelming rather than welcome. Those with social anxiety may fear awkward moments, silence, or perceived social failure. Hosting guests amplifies these fears because the interaction happens in a personal space, raising the emotional stakes. Individuals with avoidant attachment styles may unconsciously resist situations that increase emotional closeness. Having guests over can feel like an unwanted level of intimacy, triggering discomfort or withdrawal. Perfectionism often contributes as well. The belief that the home must look a certain way or that hosting must be flawless can lead people to avoid guests entirely rather than risk perceived failure. Psychology also connects this behavior to high self-awareness. People who are deeply introspective may find it hard to relax when others are present, constantly monitoring their own behavior and emotions. For some, resentment builds when social expectations conflict with personal needs. Cultural or familial norms that equate hospitality with moral value can intensify guilt while reinforcing avoidance. People who value efficiency and mental clarity may see guests as a disruption to productivity. Even enjoyable visits can feel costly when they interfere with focus or personal goals. From a psychological standpoint, these traits do not indicate dysfunction. Instead, they reflect individual differences in energy management, emotional processing, and social tolerance. Psychology places strong emphasis on past experiences when interpreting why some people hate having guests over. The human brain is highly associative, meaning that repeated emotional patterns linked to specific situations tend to solidify into long-term behavioral preferences. When hosting has historically been tied to stress, discomfort, or emotional overload, avoidance becomes a natural response. Many individuals grew up in environments where guests were not a source of joy but a trigger for tension. Parents may have become irritable, overly controlling, or emotionally unavailable when visitors arrived, unintentionally teaching children that guests equal pressure rather than connection. In some households, guests disrupted stability. Loud conversations, arguments, or a lack of routine may have accompanied visits, leaving lasting impressions that social presence inside the home is destabilizing rather than comforting. For others, the issue stems from a lack of privacy in early life. Growing up in homes where personal space was constantly invaded by relatives, neighbors, or acquaintances can lead to an adult desire to strictly control access to one's living space. Psychology also recognizes the impact of emotional labor learned in childhood. Children who were expected to perform, behave perfectly, or emotionally accommodate guests may later associate hosting with exhaustion and self-erasure. Negative adult experiences reinforce these patterns. Guests who overstayed, ignored boundaries, criticized personal choices, or created emotional burdens can permanently alter how hospitality is perceived. When someone repeatedly feels drained or disrespected after hosting, the brain learns to associate guests with emotional loss. Over time, even the anticipation of a visit can trigger stress responses. Trauma plays a particularly important role. For people who have experienced emotional, physical, or psychological trauma, the home often becomes a symbol of safety. Inviting others in may feel threatening on a nervous system level, even when no conscious fear exists. Psychology explains that the body remembers what the mind may not actively recall. A sense of unease around guests can originate from unresolved emotional memories stored below conscious awareness. Obligation is another powerful conditioning factor. Individuals who were taught that refusing guests is rude or immoral may host despite discomfort, building resentment that eventually transforms into avoidance. Repeated hosting out of guilt rather than desire trains the brain to associate visitors with self-betrayal. Over time, dislike replaces neutrality and neutrality turns into aversion. Social burnout also contributes to learned avoidance. In modern life, constant communication through work, messaging, and social media leaves many people emotionally depleted before guests even arrive. For these individuals, hosting feels like the final demand on an already exhausted nervous system. The home becomes the only place where social demands can temporarily cease. Cultural expectations intensify this learning. In cultures where hospitality is idealized, people who struggle with it may internalize shame, reinforcing the emotional weight of hosting. Psychology notes that shame deepens avoidance. Rather than confronting discomfort directly, individuals protect themselves by eliminating the triggering situation altogether. Over time, avoidance becomes self-reinforcing. The longer someone goes without hosting, the stronger the association between peace and solitude becomes. Importantly, psychology does not frame this behavior as antisocial or cold. It is viewed as adaptive, especially when past experiences taught the individual that hosting came at a personal cost. Avoiding guests is often an unconscious strategy to regain agency, emotional safety, and control over one's environment. In this sense, the dislike of having guests over is not about rejecting others, but about honoring deeply learned emotional needs. Psychology ultimately interprets this behavior as a form of self-preservation shaped by memory, experience, and emotional conditioning rather than hostility or selfishness. Psychology often interprets the home not merely as a physical space, but as an extension of personal identity. For people who hate having guests over, their home represents who they are when no one is watching, making the presence of others feel deeply intrusive. Unlike public spaces, the home allows individuals to express habits, preferences, and routines without social correction. When guests enter this space, that freedom is compromised, and the individual may feel disconnected from their authentic self. Many people curate their homes to reflect their inner world, emotional state, and values. Guests introduce external perceptions into that space, which can feel like an invasion of identity rather than a simple visit. Psychology explains that when someone strongly links their sense of self to their environment, sharing that environment can trigger vulnerability. Guests are no longer just people, but observers of one's private reality. This discomfort is often heightened in individuals who value introspection. Their home serves as a mental retreat where thoughts can unfold without interruption, and guests disrupt that internal dialogue. There is also a symbolic loss of ownership that occurs when others occupy personal space. Even temporary guests alter how the home functions, which can feel like losing control over one's personal domain. Some individuals experience a subtle pressure to edit themselves when guests are present. Small behaviors such as relaxing, resting, or being emotionally quiet may suddenly feel inappropriate, creating internal tension. Psychology connects this reaction to self-concept clarity. People who have a strong sense of who they are may resist situations that force them into social roles that feel inauthentic. For these individuals, hosting guests means temporarily becoming a version of themselves that exists for others rather than for their own emotional needs. There is also an unconscious fear of misalignment. Guests may not understand the meaning behind personal choices, decor, or lifestyle, leading to feelings of being misunderstood or judged. Even when no judgment is expressed, the anticipation of interpretation can be enough to cause stress. Psychology shows that perceived evaluation often impacts behavior more than real evaluation. The home is where emotional regulation happens naturally. When guests are present, that regulation must be consciously managed, increasing cognitive and emotional load. Over time, people who repeatedly feel disconnected from themselves while hosting may begin to associate guests with self-loss rather than connection. Avoiding guests then becomes a way to protect personal identity and emotional coherence. Psychology does not interpret this as selfishness. Instead, it reflects a deep need for authenticity and self-alignment. For these individuals, solitude at home is not loneliness but a form of psychological grounding. Ultimately, hating to have guests over can be understood as a desire to preserve the integrity of one's inner world. The home becomes sacred space, and limiting access is a way to honor personal identity. In this light, avoiding guests is not rejection of others, but affirmation of self. Psychology views this pattern as a meaningful response to the need for authenticity, autonomy, and emotional stability.